All right, so I'm here with Pete Stern, and Pete, you farm,
Yes, we do. Yep.
um, but probably you've been involved in agriculture your whole life. You're retired from another pretty important aspect of American agriculture.
Yeah, after I graduated from River Falls, I'm originally from eastern Wisconsin and over by New London. And my ag teacher really was the one that got me coming up to River Falls. I didn't know anything about River Falls, but he had graduated from here. And then after graduation in 1980 from River Falls, I worked at the Equity Elevator for a year in River Falls, which is no longer there. That's where basically City Hall is and some other apartment buildings. But and then I wanted to go and get into financing or whatever because a friend of mine in town here, at that time I got to know at the co-op, Tom Sitz said, "Oh, you got to get into farm credit." So that's what I did. I ended up getting into farm credit, starting with the PCA, Production Credit Association, and then we merged with the Land Bank back in the 80s. So it's Farm Credit. And then we merged with AgStar and then Computer Financial is the last one I worked for. So I almost had 40 years and I was just short of 40 years working in farm credit.
Yeah,
I just remember starting when I was at the PCA, I was as a trainee over in Shawano, Appleton area there. And the guy said, "Oh, the PCA at Chippewa Falls, they're so fast growing." You know, and I went over, this is the early 80s. Well, nobody knew what the storm was coming because interest rates were already high. So
right.
the storm came afterwards, after I got over there to Chippewa Falls. So then I came up to River Falls in '88. So.
Okay, so to back up even further, then you grew up on a farm.
Yep. We had my dad and mom had milk cows, and then, but they sold them in '64 and then rented the land to the neighbors. And then, so it's kind of around agriculture. We still did maple syrup and stuff, so I know about maple syrup. And that farm had been in the family since '46 or whatever, when my grandfather had bought it, and my grandmother. But so it's still in the family. They still make maple syrup. But when I came over here, I just remember our rocks were a little bit bigger over there. If you ever been through Tigerton, you have some of those kind of rocks over there by Northport, New London area. But anyways, yeah, so I came up here to River Falls then, and for agriculture.
Because you said your ag teacher advised you. So you were an FFA, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I was an FFA. Don Cutler was his name. Very nice guy. He was originally from Abbotsford, central part of the state. And you just didn't, when you're young, you don't know anything. We had Hillshire Farms in New London, so and it's still Hillshire is still there, and that was kind of like you went to work at Hillshire, or you went into the paper mills in the valley or whatever, because that was all paper mills and everything over there. It was very, you know, but my ag teacher said, well, if you're going to go 3 years over to Lakeside or whatever, or Manitowoc, why don't you just go to River Falls? It's one more year, so. Which really was a good thing. I mean,
Yeah.
River Falls was a good school, and I really enjoyed it. And it gave me a lot of opportunities I wouldn't have had without it. So learned a lot about agriculture. But then my friend and I, after that, we started farming. A friend that I met up here in River Falls, Brian Rasmussen, and we started farming over in eastern Wisconsin. So, and I was working for the farm credit system already then too, and I never left that. We just farmed on the side. He was the co-op manager and fertilizer manager over there at Waiwega. So, and we did that, did hay and some corn and whatever, and he was working there at the co-op, and then in '86 he bought some cows. So dairy cows. So we had a half of a herd with a guy that
Okay.
owned the farm. So, but yeah. So I was working for the farm credit system, and so yeah, we did have. I remember that spring of '86. I'll get ahead of myself here a little bit, but we went to the bank, and Brian liked to buy machinery, so which is fine. But we never had any big machinery. And I just know that we'd used the operating note to buy some machinery, which we didn't have much of. And the banks said, well, I can't give you a operating note because you didn't pay back the last year's. And you think of this as 86.
Yeah.
So, but it worked out. It all worked out. It just had to change things around a little bit. But, but the machinery was smaller stuff that it wasn't anything big. But in 86, it didn't matter. Nobody liked agriculture in 86.
No, and there's a story I have involving you we'll get to later, but ag lending is in more recent times has become somewhat of a darling of banks. Like even in Ellsworth there, BMO bought out M&I or whatever, and I remember getting courted by you actually had bankers reaching out to you about stuff where before as a farmer you were like
the plague.
Right, they didn't want you. They're like, if you called them, it was, is this so we can give you your turn down so you can go to FSA?
Yeah, it was the 80s. I mean, when I first started for the PCA and then we went into the Federal Land Bank and did work for both of them, basically with Farm Credit. With the interest rates being so high, it seemed like it was a delayed reaction because the same thing happened in the housing industry in the early 2000s. It seems when things get all disjointed and out of whack, it takes a while for the pain to develop.
Yeah.
And that's what happened in the farm side. It just, the pain started developing because, you start get deflation going and nobody wants to buy anything because nobody had any money.
Right.
Because you couldn't sell anything. And
well, and there was just a lack of liquidity.
Yeah, there was no liquidity. And it was, so then it just starts feeding on itself. Because I remember the land values because we had a base that they used on the farmland and stuff went from like, I don't know, $1,400 an acre in the early 80s in River Falls area, went down to like $650 or something like that. So it dropped about half price around this area. And it's just, the farmers are becoming illiquid. The lenders are becoming illiquid because all of a sudden now the auditors come in and say, you don't have any equity left. The farmers don't have any. And then now the lenders have a loan that's underwater. So then they start eating into their equity. So, we worked through all that stuff. But we were fortunate, the 7th Farm Credit District, because I don't know if people remember, but in 86, 87, the Farm Agribank came out with a program and said, if you buy the farm and if you don't want it in 5 years, we'll take it back 5 or 7 years. And that put the floor in. That was the end of keep going lower, which really helped put a base under under losing equity all the time, because it was deflation, So too much inflation is really bad, but deflation can get really bad.
Oh,
it turns everything in nasty. So.
Well, you had farmers that were probably able to cash flow that probably had loans called just because.
They might have went into, they called them 2516s or whatever, and what they were is basically you had to look at all the assets compared to what the value was of the assets compared to what loan you had on it. So do you have to set up an allowance for loss on that loan? I remember working with some people that they had no equity. They were underwater.
Yeah.
But they still survived. The key was trying to figure out, if you can cash flow your payments somehow without going further behind. And sometimes you might have to sell off a little assets or something to make it work, even though it was probably not right time to sell it. But it was just, sometimes you had to get smaller, because I ran into that with one person in the early 2000 or mid 2009, 2010. They had another lender, and I worked with them too. But their other lender on their other business came to them and said, we don't want to loan you any more money. We want out. Their loans were too big for that bank or lender because they were getting collapsed by the housing market. So they needed to get smaller to survive. The lender needed to get smaller to survive. It wasn't that they're bad on their loans. They just couldn't handle their size of loans that they had that they wanted out because they were running out of equity because of the housing market. So, but yeah, it can be interesting.
Yeah, that whole time period I find fascinating, you know, because as a kid in the 80s, I mean, seeing firsthand, you drive around here today, when's the last time you even saw like a farmstead for sale? Like an actual whole farm with a for sale sign on it. It just doesn't happen.
Not so much around here. You may have to go to central Wisconsin, maybe a little bit more, but not just around here. It just doesn't happen.
Right. And as a kid in the 80s, there were, if you wanted to buy a farm, there's how many to pick from.
I remember when I came up to River Falls in '88, forward from Chippewa Falls, I think we had 6 pages of farmland that we had control of or whatever.
Yeah.
In the Pierce and St. Croix County area.
And that was through PCA and both probably FMHA properties too.
No, it wasn't FHA. It was just the Federal Land Bank properties and the PCA properties that we had gotten back. You know, the 70s were grow, go, go. You know, grow it, we'll sell it. You know, the government says we're robots, all that whole deal. But you know, when interest rates, you know, I think the one operating note that I got, my friend and I, in '83, I think I paid 19% for an operating loan. It was 18% for the real estate loan. Wow. Now, it was small loans, but they were crazy. I don't know, you know.
Well, you didn't have any tax problems.
No, there was no tax problems. But you didn't realize how bad it was because it was kind of a slow creep into it over time that had happened. And inflation was 13% or whatever it was. It was just, everything was crazy. But you know, it came to a head because interest rates will take care of things if they get high enough. So,
well, the farmers that were actually in with FMHA were somewhat maybe lucky because a lot of times the FMHA stuff was fixed interest, wasn't it?
Yeah.
PCA tended to be variable rate.
You know, we had the PCA was variable, the Federal Land Bank was variable, so everything was kind of scary times, you know. Today, you know, everything, you can fix pretty much everything.
Right.
But the operating loans, not so much, but is a little bit tougher to do. Usually it's better to be, you know, on a variable, but you know, a lot of suppliers now have these teaser rates or whatever to have you go with them, so you can use those too, but yeah, it's when the fixed rates came in the 80s that really, I don't, you never say never, but that was a lot of the issue is when you went from like real estate loans of 7-8% up to, I think we got up to like 12.75% on Federal Land Bank.
Yeah.
And then the PCA was up to, you know, when you had 10% stock and it was almost up to 18% interest rates, and it was just nasty. And so yeah, I think most of the rates now from when I was there, you know, it's been 4 years since I retired, but you know, it was they're all fixed. The real estate loans are basically pretty much, and then any machinery loans are fixed. Maybe your operating notes might not. So that takes that kind of off the table. That helps a lot.
Yep.
So.
Well, in loan even, you could have $10 million of equity in something and have no income that you could show. You can't get a loan.
Yeah, you got to have liquidity. You got to have cash flow. So.
Right. Where back then, a lot of times, I think part of the problem with the farm crisis was loan structure. You had guys that weren't ever making money that were just borrowing against the inflation of their assets.
Yeah, there was some of that going on. I think, you know, people are operating losses. You know, that's where they were getting capitalized. The operating losses were getting rolled into cap. You know, they were just
Right.
getting rolled over, and you know, and that's where the farm financial standards came out in the '80s, like you know, trying to, you know, work, you know, the liquidity, you know, loan to collateral, you know, what's your break evens, you know, where are you at on everything, and being careful. You know, people are more conscious of liquidity
Yeah.
because I don't know if you remember, but in I think it was 2006 or something, Ford went out and borrowed everything they could, and I don't know why they did it, whatever, but they must have seen something that GM and Chrysler didn't see, and they didn't do that, and then who went bankrupt? You know, Chrysler and GM went bankrupt because of obviously they got restructured and got survived it, but different ways. But Ford never went through that because they had the liquidity. But
Right.
the problem is when you need the money, you can't go get it.
Yeah.
So you got to, you know, and that's the thing about liquidity is, and it's hard for most people to do that, is to sit on cash or sit on liquidity and pay interest on it. But when you have the liquidity, you're in control. Otherwise, over time, as things get worse, usually what happens to lenders is, you know, the auditors get, you know, they have to be concerned about what they're trying to protect then too, because they have shareholders or whatever, or investors or whatever that have to look, make sure they're doing the right thing. So
Yep.
that, and they get a little more aggressive as the auditors come in. So, but
Well, was a it was an interesting time then, and in a lot of ways, I don't know. I mean, there were some good points in there with lower values. I always say I think there was a lot more opportunity back then, as far as you know. Today, you can't just buy a farm and start farming. Where, you know, back then I think there was a little bit more opportunity, and let's face it, it wasn't as lucrative as it is today. But look at the input. Look at what an acre of corn costs to plant today versus say 1991.
yeah, it takes, you know, it takes non-farm income to get into farming. I mean, still today, or something,
Yep.
some help or something. And it's just, it takes something. It can still be done. It's just probably going to take a little bit longer at the high asset values.
Yeah.
I mean, I just remember there back in the '80s, there was a lot of farm service agency loans that, I mean, they had basically kind of 100% finance people to get in, but it didn't work out. It was just too much for them. Too much leverage with not enough income. It just didn't work out. So, you know, it just takes income now. Today, non-farm income is to get it going. You know, you got to start small. The thing that I've noticed over the years is the biggest problem that you run into now is the health insurance. There's just, somebody needs to be
Yeah.
off the farm for the health insurance because it's become such a huge ticket item on the farm. You pay now for health insurance what you used to pay for family living. So
Yeah.
it's just, so now you got family living on top of it. So it's just really, it really makes it hard. And I mean, when my friend and I started out, we were working out the farm, and we just started buying equipment, what we needed, and you know, you didn't worry about loan structure as much or whatever. You just bought it and just rolled stuff over. But then as the '80s got tighter and tighter, and the lenders are getting like, you can't do this, you can't do that, you know, you can't. So then it made people understand better what they needed to do. So the '80s were a good learning lesson too. And in the '90s were too, because people were still learning from the stuff that happened.
Well, there was so much fallout from that.
Yeah,
You know, there's well, the guy that replaced your job when you retired, and I have talked about this, that he feels sometimes that farmers that grew up through that era and stuff tend to be leaned towards too conservative. They were afraid to take any risks after surviving, you know, through that.
yeah, that can be some truth about that. And I mean, I just had some of the things that I maybe could have been more aggressive in the last 20 years about different things, but you know, you get a little gun shy because you remember those times of,
Oh,
so you just want to be a little more, you know, I don't know. They always said there was a 50-year land cycle. Well, the 50 years are coming up here you know, probably about, you know, 80s, you know, your mid 80s, 86. So, you know, 50 years on top of that. So that's what they say. I think there's a lot of things that have helped a lot. Take some of that is crop insurance has helped. I think fixed interest rates are a huge thing.
yes.
But, you know, obviously we're going through some tariff stuff right now, but you know, we've been through that before. So I don't know. I don't know. I look at what land values are now, and you know, that really makes it tough for a young person. I don't know where it's all gonna. They're really gonna need some help to me to get it done. But
Yeah. That's why I think, in my opinion, we need to overhaul the Farm Bill, and, you know, rather than, you know, like some of the subsidized crop insurance stuff could get changed just from the standpoint, and some of the, you know, some of this, we're worried about tariffs and the effect on our farm economy. And a lot of that's because we're dependent on exports, but yet we're importing a lot of meat and a lot of small grains, etc. I think we're probably better off to just diversify our own agriculture maybe a little bit more. And because if I always say that people say, well, there's no, you know, we can't find young people that want to do all this, but there's a ton of young people. You dealt with over the years. I'm sure there were a ton of young people that reached out to you trying to get into farming.
yeah, I worked a lot with the Farm Service Agency. I tried to use the Young and Beginning Farmer programs. One of them was the 50, 45, 5. We'd do 50% of the loan. FSA would do 45%, and the young people had to come up with cover some of the fees, so it's probably about 7%, 8%, and that was always a good program for real estate purchases.
But
It worked. There was other things I worked with them, the federal government on. So.
but there were plenty of young people that wanted to farm, but there isn't any opportunity.
Yeah, it's more now if it's a family member that already was, the parents are
Right.
farming or whatever, and the kids want to come in. That's what I
Yeah.
see more now. It wasn't somebody that just was working off and wanted to get into farming. You probably don't see that as much.
And that's where I think maybe, so the best opportunity, I think, for you know, young farmers starting out, more opportunity in agriculture is livestock. It takes more people with livestock, you know, than, I mean, look at the number of farmers that were in Pierce County, you know, 50 years ago,
Right.
40 years ago,
Right.
when this area was primarily dairy. You know, there were always crop farmers around here because
Right.
of our location.
Right.
But when it was primarily livestock, the amount of farmers was, you know, there were a lot more farmers.
Yeah, well, usually almost everybody in Pierce County at one time probably had livestock, but it rolled over into more of the crop, you know,
Yeah.
because we're so close to the river. You know,
Right.
We got access at Red Wing and now Hager City and with rail, and you know, and we had St. Paul Market, and
Yeah.
you know, so we've had really good access to outside markets outside the area, you know, so we've been very fortunate in that.
Well, I always say that the areas that were primarily crop farm in our area, like if you look at, say, the neighborhood I grew up in, or the, you know, Man Valley, or, you know, Hager City down there on the flat. Those areas were, I mean, you saw legs and all that kind of stuff around there. Guys were grain farming years and years, decades ago,
Yeah,
because that land was so good,
right.
right? Where a lot of these areas, you know, kind of stayed in livestock because, well, it's hit and miss. It's not as good, but we can, you know, it makes really
Right.
good for livestock, but then, now it's just all row cropped.
It seems like over the years, it seems like you have some diversification has been a good thing.
Yeah.
For a while there, they said, "Oh, get focused in on really one thing and do one thing really well." And it seems like if it's non-farm income or livestock and crops or whatever, or just having opportunities to generate different income sources, because when one thing is down, maybe the other thing is up. It seems like it's worked over the years for some of the people I've worked with, is that they've had really good fortunes doing that. But not all operations have enough labor to do all that, because you just get spread too thin. So,
Well, yeah, I graduated in 96 in that, so, like even an FFA and ag class in the mid 90s, they were telling, us back then, specialize in dairy. Like, if you're going to milk cows, you milk cows. You don't raise heifers. They were telling guys, don't raise your own feed. You can buy feed, and that was a disaster. I mean, they even encouraged some guys to sell their land because you're tying up all that capital in land. You could use all that for facilities and technology, and then rent the land back or buy the feed. And
oh yeah, I remember that. That was yeah.
it was a disaster.
Not having control of your feed is a huge thing on anything that has livestock. Can make it, especially when you're talking forage needs. It makes it very scary.
Yeah, because even when I went full-time dairy farming when I was 24, I remember at that time I had enough land to grow all my forage, but I'd have to buy some shelled corn. That wasn't the end of the world.
Right.
But even then, I still did better once I had control of that. Because you could say, I can figure on this average corn price will be this. But that 1 year that it doubles in price, it really hurts.
Right.
Where this way you can kind of,
Buy some and have control. It's having control of your inputs is a huge thing on anything with livestock. And the crop farm is controlling expenses and marketing it's a huge thing. The marketing is and it's hard to miss out on the big one, the high one.
Yeah.
But it might be 2 or 3 years out of 10, but the other 7 or 8 are it's just if you don't sell ahead or try to protect yourself, it can be just a disaster.
There's a few of those older farmers that have no debt that can just grow it, put it in a bin, and wait. And a few of them guys have hit some massive paydays.
Yeah, the marketing seems to be, because guys can grow it. They seem to do a really good job with that. It's the marketing is the hard, and it's hard. It's just really hard, and there's so much information coming at you, and it's really hard to do feel like the right thing. I mean, farming, I just remember in the 80s, it's kind of like, we were farming, putting money into the crops, we were putting money into the cattle, we were doing and working, bought some land, sold it for less than we paid for it, because my friend needed to move, and because where we were working, we couldn't figure it out. The 80s were kind of a lost 10 years. It just seems like you paid high, you sold low. It just things, and and we didn't have a lot of debt or whatever at that time, but it was just really hard to make any money in the 80s. But once you got out of the 80s, things started to turn around in the 90s, and there was opportunities to, by then the asset values were low enough, you could make some money again. Things were starting to move, opportunities.
The 90s, I look at some of those guys that got big in the 90s that, I mean, you talk about a common thing. People say, well, you can't buy land and make it cash flow. And I always say, well, when has it ever cash flowed? Or when have you ever been able to do that? But there was a brief time in the 90s where it was not far off. Or you bought it in 1990, and by 1993, you were making money ahead of your payment
Yeah.
on that ground.
But the only thing was a lender, you can only go back and say, here's where we've been, and can we manage this or
Right.
make it through this if this happens again. So you get you get a little of that going on, and then when you get farther away from the disaster, you can be a little more optimistic, and because you kind of allowed to look at a 3 or 5 year average and kind of see where you're at. So so it's really hard to project high prices. You can
Yeah.
only go back and say, here's what we've been through. Can we make it at these levels to get through? And and it's like the yields. Soybean yields haven't really changed much over time.
No.
But corn has changed tremendously.
Oh.
And so that it's kind of the same chase that the dairy guys are on, and I just remember 15,000 pound herd averages. Now it's like 30. So,
Right.
you got more of everything, and it's the same with now you grow more corn, but
Yeah, people will say that. They'll go, we're getting the same price for this as we did back, name the year. And it's like, well, you do. But I mean, you don't even have to go back that far on the corn. When, I graduated in 96. And if you had 100 bushel an acre corn yield in 1996, it was okay. That was,
yeah.
you weren't complaining about it, and
No.
now, I mean, if you're talking, anything under 200 and guys are getting a little crabby,
Yeah. So it's still a volume thing. That's why I like, on the what what's your gross per acre, is that probably is better thing to look at than what you're getting for each sale or whatever. Try to get your gross up so you can cover all your expenses and stuff and make some income. But
yeah, the margins, I think that was the scary part is years ago, I always say when I started full-time dairy farming, we used to get that, they call it a conservation payment. As long as you were following your conservation plan on your farm or whatever, in the spring, they'd give us that one payment. And then the dividend from the milk check from the creamery.
Yep.
Between those two things, I could cover most of my crop inputs.
Inputs, yeah.
Because, as a dairy farmer, I wasn't selling extra crops. So you would have, for me milking 50 cows, I'd probably have 60 acres of corn, and then you'd have 30 acres of new seeding, and then you'd have 60 acres of, existing hay or something, that was there, and you could cover your inputs just off of those. So, years ago, if you had a shortfall on the farm, maybe you could do something to offset that. Like you could do a little extra work or pick up a part-time job or something to offset that. The numbers have gotten so big that if say you're farming 2,000 acres and there's a big shortfall, you can't say, well, this winter I'm going to go get a job somewhere. And
Right.
the numbers are just, huge.
Yeah, everything's huge nowadays. So,
Yeah. But in your career, so let's talk about coming back to, or you went to UWRF.
yep.
Did you want to come back here? Did you see an opening in the farm credit?
When we merged back in '87, we had the Farm Credit of Northwest Wisconsin had like 135 people, and then obviously everything was in chaos.
Well, PCA and
Federal Land Bank.
they had actually
We were under joint management. There's still two separate co-ops. There still is today. There's still the Federal Land Credit Association and the PCA on both sides. But together they call them like for Compeer or wherever or ag, or it could be Farm Credit. But there's still because the real estate side is tax exempt. And that's how it was originally set up. So then the PCA is more the operating side, the short-term stuff. And that's a taxable entity, co-op. There's still two co-ops. But
Okay.
they're under one umbrella, and
Well, Congress in the 80s ended up stepping in, right, at one point,
yes,
because they were
yep.
insolvent, right?
Yeah, so they got like $15 billion or something.
Yeah.
But that was a loan, and it was paid back.
Okay.
So it was paid back, and Congress had done that in the 30s also
Yeah.
to help get liquidity out to the farmers, because the farmers, all the loans were getting called. A lot of them were getting called because the banks had no. I just saw a program yesterday. They talked about run on the bank. Well, the banks had no money. So it was. Yeah, there was things that had happened. I could give you the whole history of the farm
Well,
credit system, but it was set up by Congress. But but all of them now, Compeer and all the other farm credits are owned by the farmers, the owners who did it.
Yep.
So
But they were chartered under the government because there was not a reliable, well,
yeah,
agriculture
yeah.
was not a stable thing to.
Yeah, you went in for a real estate loan, you had a 1-year note. Well, it doesn't work very good to
Right.
pay on a real estate loan for 1 year. But, I mean, you'd have to renew it and do all that stuff. But now you can get a 25-year loan or 20-year loan on a piece of land and make your payments. You got your fixed rate, you
Yep.
know what the payments are. It makes a lot easier for a long-term planning or whatever. And yeah, the 80s were, I just remember sitting in 85, sitting in the PCA Chippewa Falls boardroom, and we went through loan files and we were writing down the real estate values, because that's what they had asked us to do, because we were looking at, here's what land is worth on your financial statement, here's what it is, because they needed to know where they were standing. So, and then we went through all that turmoil, and I'll come back, going ahead a little bit there. We went from 135 people in 87 down to like 70.
Oh, wow.
So, and that was an opportunity. At that time, there was people moving between Chippewa Falls and River Falls and Menominee and Luck or whatever, and I ended up in River Falls. Had an opportunity to come to River Falls, so
Okay.
that's how I ended up back in River Falls, and so it worked out good. Pierce St. Croix County. I mean, even over Chippewa Falls, the whole northwest Wisconsin. There's a lot of agriculture. There's a lot of opportunities. I've been blessed with all the opportunities I had, working for the farm credit system. A lot of excellent people to work with. My friend and I over in eastern Wisconsin, we learned a whole lot about farming in the 80s and 90s and whatever, and he's still farming. And he did other jobs just like I did, but we're kind of the hobby farmer generation, I guess, that still worked out. But we hope to have our son is interested in farming, and he's farming with us some. But there's a lot of opportunity that I think still for young people. Ours is a real small farm. We still, it's a lot of manual labor, but there's still opportunities for farmers, young people out there. You just got to find the right niche or fit or whatever. And I read all the time in the different farm publications or online what people are doing to get going and starting. It can be done. Because I see what's happened with my friend that I farm with. Brian. His kids are farming. His one son's milking cows and their family, and the other one's crop farming. And so there's a lot of opportunities. I still feel there is. It just might be a little bit different than getting started. But like you said earlier, sooner or later the land will turn over.
Yeah.
So it'll have to
will.
go to some generation, and I just hope it stays an individual type farm stuff, or family type farms. I mean, they might be bigger, but at least people have an opportunity, because I think when you have ownership of stuff, and there's more drive to do
Yes.
to do more. Be better.
That's why I guess I've always had a problem with, we saw, the dairy industry and hogs. The expansion that happened in there is almost mind-numbing. If you looked at a chart of herd size growth, it just hit a point and then just went skyrocketed, right? And guys would say, well, we can't get help to do this. So that's why their justification for, say, hiring illegal immigrants, et cetera, was, well, we needed to do this because we can't find people to do the job. And my thinking on that has always been the work got done when people own the small farm that had the small herd of cows, because you will work harder. I worked harder than any illegal immigrant ever did when I milked 3 times a day by myself. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's when you have ownership, stake in something, boy, your productivity is amazing.
Yeah, I was just reading an article about over in central Wisconsin about I think it's Piesik Farm or whatever over there. They got a lot of. There's a couple other farms together. They got a lot of robots.
Yep.
And they're still family farms. They figure out a way to do it with robots.
Yeah.
And that's why I think there's opportunities for everybody, depending on how you want to do it. I know. I know there's opportunities for young people. It's just it's going to be different than what we understand it as. So I think that's what it's going to be, a little bit different. So
Well, I tell my daughter loves the cattle, and I tell her that the opportunity there is probably in some more direct marketing, some
Yep.
more niche sort of stuff. Like I think there's a some niche dairy opportunity there, cheese making, etc. So the idea of milking 80 cows maybe isn't as going to be as lucrative as milking 12.
right, yeah, it's the thing you run into is that you run into the smaller operations is everything becomes more manual, and you
Yep.
can only do so much, and that's why you see the bigger operations, because it's just a capital thing. You can do more with it. Well, it's kind of like, you think, well, if you're milking 12 cows and I wanted to do 24, it's kind of
Right.
the same thing that happened with all the dairy barns before, where you looked at them and they went from 15, 20 cows, all of a sudden they had 40, and then they had
Yeah.
60, and then they had 120, and then, because the son wanted to come home. It's the same thing. It's technology. We've bought some equipment in the last few years, and it's more than I've ever had, but it sure has helped a lot, and made us a lot more efficient.
Oh
And
yeah.
then do I have more equipment invested, and that I probably, but it's sure a lot easier. But I'm not any younger either, so
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
but
So then when you came back in '87 there, going from Chippewa Falls to here, was there a big difference as far as our land is different?
yeah, it's different over here. North of Chippewa Falls is pretty sand. It can be lighter soils
Yep.
in the prairie there. Eau Claire is different areas over there, different type of soils and different stuff. It's over here. You're closer to Minnesota, so you got. And if you look at it's just warmer, a little bit warmer over here than there, because you're getting closer to central Wisconsin. So
I
it's just warmer. You're getting closer to southern Minnesota here. So.
Yeah, I was always told. Well, and actually, I was talking about that the other day, that the river actually kind of control. If you look at frost dates, there's areas south of us that have an a later frost date than we do here,
Right.
even
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
because the Mississippi is our land around here. We've got everything from, there's some poorer ground to some stuff that's as good as anything in the U.S. I've been told, in places, because the river and the glaciers didn't level this area out.
Well, just on the east side of River Falls to the west side of River Falls, there's probably a week difference of just because of the soil types. There's a lot of soil type difference.
Right.
So it's you go to. I had some friends in northern St. Croix County, up by, up there north of Glenwood City, up in there, and I mean they were always a week and a half behind us just from here.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, soil types have a lot to do with it. But
And it changes so fast because you'd look at down there, like on the prairie, down there, like by Hager City, Swanson,
yeah,
Schoders,
yeah.
and stuff. From them to the other end of Pierce County, I mean, you could be 10 days
Oh yeah, yeah,
easily.
yeah, 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 yeah. It's yeah,
Because, yeah, even like you said, dealing with the whole Minnesota influence, I think technology wise, here, this area probably mirrored Minnesota a little bit more than, say, the further east you go. It seems like I think now with the internet and with technology as a whole is kind of leveled across this country. But even an old machinery jockey once told me, he said it starts in Illinois. He said then Iowa would get it, then Minnesota would get it, and he says then it would come to Wisconsin.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But we had enough of that Minnesota influence
Right.
where we were at, and
Yeah.
I mean even the difference from southern Pierce County to St. Croix County is significant.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, a lot more. There was always a lot of grain farming down this way, and well, I mean, just think if you're in Chippewa Falls and you're grain farming, your basis difference is massive compared to, say, if you're
Right,
hauling to the
right,
river here,
right.
And I always said around here that our farm size, profitable farm size, was smaller than a lot of areas.
Yeah.
A 1,000-acre farmer around here crop farming today is probably still doing fairly well.
Yeah, and there's always some non-farm income in it. My concern, you were talking about farm sizes there, as and opportunities for young people. I was thinking about it is like going up in St. Croix County. You start pulling land out for solar panels. What's that going to do to things? And I know some down in Pierce County
Yeah.
too. And I really get concerned about that. What that's going to do for young people. And
Well, and it compounds the problem because, well, like the area they want to do in Pierce County, that's as good a land probably as there is in the county. That neighborhood.
well, the same up in St. Croix County, and that's kind of, you start pulling all that land out. I don't know. I don't know enough about them, but it just seems like that's not a good thing to do.
Well, and you've got really, like down there, that's really productive ground. And then you're pulling that out to put solar panels in. And it's not just that you're losing acres already, because there's already a competition for acres, right? But now you've got guys that are going to be looking for a place to put this money, because they maybe don't want to quit farming. So now they're getting this income from the solar panels that's going to cause them to either drive land values or land rents up somewhere else to offset.
Yeah.
And, you end up, I think there's a lot better areas that we could put solar on than prime farmland.
Yeah, I don't know where it's all going to end up.
I don't think though that we should necessarily be telling landowners what they can and can't do.
No.
That's a scary thing.
Yeah. No, I know. I don't know where it's all going to end up. I just know it'll make it harder for young people because you're always losing land to development all the time, and I guess it might be just more of it. I don't know. Going to development. I mean, it'll be interesting to see where it all turns out. I just know we were talking about how young people to get in when you start taking acres off the table. So.
Well, and people talk about that. We lose X number of farmland acres every single year. And I've heard people roll their eyes and say, "Well, no, there's no way." But come to Pierce County. I mean, how many houses have you seen pop up around here in the last 30 years? It's amazing, and then industrial developments. I mean, from River Falls, basically, I always say from the time you hit Semstone, if you're coming from Ellsworth to River Falls, from the time you hit Semstone, you are now in the Twin Cities the rest of the way.
Yeah, the town of River Falls does have some unique stuff going on here with exclusive ag and different things, and so that has been helpful to kind of hold the farmland. So that's been a good thing because we're an exclusive ag pretty much on our whole farm here. So,
Okay.
but we have 20 acres that are not in it. That's one really steep farm, but we farm it, so I don't know. I mean, it's just it's just hard to know where agriculture is all going to go and where everything is going
Yeah.
to go. You just have to look for opportunities where you're at, and like you said, you don't want to take opportunities away from farmers to do what they want to do because they took the risk to buy the land and
Right.
do all this stuff. And I don't know. Guess we'll know in a few years how it all turns out.
Well, and my guess is that some of this is gonna probably fade out. I think one of the farmers that was signed up for that project down there just told me this weekend they're out. Mm-hmm. So, but that's neither here nor there. I just don't know that all this with our current administration, if there's going to be as much incentive to do it as there was before. And I guess as a landowner, if that kind of backing can change with the whims of the political party in charge at the current time, I'd be very leery of signing a long-term contract on anything that every 4 years could be,
Yeah.
Yeah,
I don't know where it's all, when we were out west a few years ago, you just see the huge solar farms in the desert or whatever. I go, well, that's a good place for them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because there wasn't nothing growing there before. So, but I don't know. I don't know where it's all going to go. Farming's, I just remember when I got out of school, there was like 44,000 dairies in Wisconsin, and that's all I wanted to do was milk cows, do that. Because that's what I knew and grew up with. But agriculture has totally changed over the years. And now there's 5,000, 6,000 in Wisconsin. Yeah. So it's just like everything keeps changing, and crop farming is totally different, and no-till farming, and all the stuff you can do with that, and I'd probably still be over in eastern Wisconsin if there had been no-till, because I would have had to pick all those rocks. Well, you don't know. You just don't know. You don't know.
Well, around here, even when you started back in River Falls, 80% of your clientele was probably smaller dairy, I would assume.
Oh yeah, there was a lot of them. There was a lot of dairies. Yeah.
And
it was Pierce County was a huge dairy area. So.
Which we had the Ellsworth Creamery here, yep. And but I bet in your career then you saw a lot of those guys transition out of dairy into crop farming.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Because it was pretty common there where a guy milked cows until he was probably late 40s, early 50s. And then the decision comes, do you expand the dairy or get out? And a lot of them, you had enough of a land base where without a lot of debt, it was pretty easy to transition to just crops to finish out your career.
Yeah, or they got a non-farm job and then they would crop farm on the side like a lot of people do, and yeah, it all worked out fine. So
yeah, it wasn't a devastation of the industry, and when small dairy went away around here, it's not like it just everybody quit farming.
Right.
There's
a lot of opportunities. I mean, like we're in our shop here, and we're in the old milking parlor. So
yeah.
Now it's our small shop, and I go down if I need something big fixed or whatever. I go down to Matt and Aaron's and get stuff fixed there. So there's a lot of things that work out. Our barn is getting close to 50 years old, and it's a single-story dairy barn. It was a freestall barn, and we've used it for something else for the last 30 some years. For hay storage and a little bit of machinery yep. storage, and it's worked great. And it was multi-purpose, and did a little remodeling here and there, but been crop farming but there's opportunities. Like I said, when we started farming this, and just like you said earlier with hay, Tom had said, Tom Sitz had said you should grow hay, sell small squares. So still doing it, and it's worked fine. So
Yeah, it's labor intensive. Anything super labor intensive tends to be a little bit more profitable.
yeah. Well, we always hire kids from church or whatever, and you didn't need a lot of machinery, and which always worked pretty well because I could had friends or neighbors that would help out. I could hire them to do any big stuff. So yeah, it worked out good. And but the kids always, it was a lot of experiences for kids that we hired over the years. So in the summer,
A lot of dirt bikes and snowmobiles got paid for throwing hay
yeah, I
bales and
suppose.
milking
Yeah,
cows.
yeah, I suppose.
Like that's there's a few things I want to ask too.
Yeah.
At one point, no, I love silos. I've always been fascinated
Okay.
with silos. People tend to sort of hate and and scapegoat the harvester silo. I'm sure you wrote some loans to put up some harvesters
Yeah, I did. I had a number of corn units back in the 80s, 90s, probably.
because that's dairy farmers. That was a labor saving thing.
Oh yeah, there was
Go
a
from
few.
grinding feed and cob corn to
Yep. I don't know if I ever did a brand new haylage unit. I had somebody ask me about that, and just couldn't make it work in the 80s. But he went and leased it anyways. But I don't know if I ever did a hay unit, because you could put up a stave unit with the unloader for like 20,000, but it was probably 75 to 80,000 for a harvester. So really,
Yeah.
I just remember when I used to go home back to New London, there was a harvester dealer by Wisconsin Rapids, and they must have had, I don't know how many harvesters on it on highway. I don't know if it was 13 or whatever, west of Rapids there, but now there's nothing there. They're all gone.
Yeah.
And it's just, and I didn't have anything against them. It's just it was really hard to cash flow them when you got 20 years after 1980, your milk price was $13 and it was still the same.
Right.
It was the same 20 years. It just really made it hard to
Yep.
cash flow them. The corn units, you could really make that work quickly because
Yeah.
of the going from dry corn to high moisture and get more yield, more production per cow, and so yeah.
And there was just the labor savings alone
Yeah, yeah.
was massive. I mean,
Yeah.
and that's where I think people don't realize how important those corn units. Because prior to that, guys were picking, cob corn, and then probably grinding feed for the dairy cows twice a week.
Yeah.
All winter long, etc. So because people will say, "Oh, those were those are the sign of a farmer that failed." But I know plenty of very successful farmers that had harvesters.
Oh yeah. No, they were good equipment. It's just that when the guys would come in and say, "I got to replace my Goliath unloader for $25,000," it's kind of like that was always hard to make work, but we got it done. And most, there's a lot of people that survived the 80s and it made a lot better, learned a lot of stuff. And so it wasn't all a bad thing. It made everybody sharpen their pencil a little bit more and understand the dynamics of stuff that was going on. Did it have an impact on a generation? Yeah, some guys didn't make it. It just worked out that way. It's just economics.
Yeah, that it left some. It probably changed agriculture as much as the Dust Bowl.
Yeah, it's 50-year land cycle, so the 30s were the last time it happened.
Right, right.
I don't know. I don't know. That's what I hope we don't go through anything like that. Because it's not a fun time.
Well, I think it affected two generations because I'm a Gen X, and the Gen Xers were growing up through the 80s, and a lot of us. That's why I say there isn't that many of us that farm, is because our generation was told, "Oh gosh, stay away. You don't want to farm."
Right.
And that's we're probably the smallest generation, but So there's two generations. And then if you look at the guys that are in their 20s and early 30s now, well, they're coming of age when things got really good in the RFS. The RFS changed a lot of stuff too.
Yeah.
So farming looked great, to a lot of these people. The same way, it looked great in the 70s, and attracted a lot of people to farming.
Right.
So it's kind of, yeah, history, there's a good line. History doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes with itself, So there,
Well, I've been through a number of cycles, and when I worked, and it goes up and down, and you just have to try to save some cash for when it's not so good. Have your options open.
well, yeah, like, because I can remember hearing corn's never going to go below $5 again.
Oh yeah.
It did.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And
It does. Everything goes in cycles.
absolutely. I mean, because there used to be quite a few hogs around here too, because South St. Paul was close and everything. Did you have any hog producers in '98, like when that got?
I never really worked with many hog producers. They might have had a few on the side, but
Yep.
nothing is any substantial. I know there was some more up in St. Croix County than in Pierce County. I spent most of my time in Pierce County, but I did have some loans up in St. Croix County too. But I never had anybody who had a lot amount of hogs. I just never really knew a lot about them. No, I had other loan officers that I worked with in southern Minnesota. They had lots of hogs. And,
Yeah.
And there's a lot down in southwest Wisconsin too, but you just don't realize it. But hogs are a huge thing, and you're right. They've gotten hurt. I know when I first started in the early '80s, they just told me that furs and feathers, and then for a while there was steers. So furs, mink,
Yep.
and then feathers would be the chickens or whatever, and then it was in the late '70s when interest rates went through the roof. Steers were operation. So everything kind of goes in cycles.
Yeah.
So you don't know when your turn is. So you just have to have some liquidity to handle it.
The steer thing, I've always heard that broke more guys than just about anything was timing on cattle.
Well, everybody was building, the cattle. They were, building all these sheds and all this stuff and then interest rates went up. So then everything's variable, and then and then you go on a 10-year, cycle on steers. 5-year good, 5-year bad. It was just and then it was just everything goes in cycles.
Yep. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. You have to remember that. So the other thing I was wondering is that there were guys that I always kind of had the mentality of if they really wanted to farm, through the 80s, there was generally a recourse back into it. Like, because I knew some guys that basically, I think they were broke that continued farming.
I worked with some. They on paper they didn't have any equity, but when they come out of it, they worked their way out of it. I mean, they had cash flow. The cash flows were the huge thing. If you could cash flow and make all your payments and stuff, and they maybe just bought at the wrong time and stuff went down, and it just happened. I have a number of people that made it through the '80s, but some of them you just couldn't even. The interest rate was so high on some, they just had to call it quits. There just was no way you could make it. You couldn't generate enough cash to even pay for the interest.
Yeah.
So it just, and the worst part was I had one, the people came to me over in Eau Claire County and they said, we have to move. And the value of their property went down so much. And it was just a small operation. It was a nice rural resident, part-time hobby farm or whatever, and they were farming some, but they also had non-farm jobs. We need to move for our jobs. They couldn't sell it. We had to take it back because they had no options. The
Really?
place was beautiful, but they had to move, but the value of their property was less than what they owed on it. So we took it back, and so it's just it was just nasty.
But a lot of those guys, I think, if they wanted to continue farming, they could probably start back up.
Yeah, there were some people that had to sell down, then got back in,
Yep.
and sometimes you had, like I said, you had to get smaller to get back into it, and that happened too. I mean, there was, it was no fault of their own. It's just that you couldn't sell anything for nothing because everything went down in value, and sometimes they just had to say, here's some of my farm back. I can't make it.
Yep.
And by then they'd gotten into the period where they lenders, FSA, the government had gotten smarter to say, okay, what is the best scenario here that we can work out to make it a win-win for everybody?
Yeah.
And at first it was more, well, we'll just foreclose on you. Well, pretty soon the lenders realize in FSA, we can't own everything. So how can we restructure you to make it go, to make it through it?
Yep.
What do you want to give up to make this work? And what were we willing to give up to make it work? Because, having people on the farm that had an interest and had wanted to make it work was a lot better than having an idle building site sitting there with nobody on it, that nobody wanted it, because that usually didn't turn out good. We had an empty building site. So.
Yeah, because you had, it's better to get something than you had no one to sell this asset to take it back, and then, depreciation on these facilities not being used was solely on the government then owning it again.
It was cost of foreclosure, cost of restructure, what we went through, trying to figure it out. But it took a while for everybody to understand that's what you needed to do because we didn't want to own everything. Farm Credit System couldn't afford to own everything. The banks couldn't afford to own everything. We needed to restructure and get everybody through this. Because it's just like the housing industry. If you were the really smart person in 2010 and 11, you would have bought every single house that you could ever buy. But nobody had any money, so it didn't matter.
Right.
So, but some people did have money and they did buy it, and it turned out really great for them. There's opportunities in your lifetime for these things to happen, but you want it to work out if you can. So, and that's it. It took everybody in the lending industry and on the farm and extension and everybody to learn that, what we needed to do. And I think the only thing is, I know that as you talk about different age groups, are they going to learn from history? I don't know, or look back at it. So, but there's things that can be done to, the same for the housing. They probably could have went in and said, the government could have bought up some houses to stop the bleeding. But it's a different animal, a house compared to a farm. So it's totally different.
It is. Well, and I think that's where around here, I hear people talk about how when land values dropped, when commodity prices dropped, like in the recent history, not the 80s. And I go, well, around here, it never really dropped. It kind of leveled off some. But it's almost like we're so insulated from even agriculture somewhat from the Twin Cities that if land values are propped up to a certain extent just on the proximity to the Twin Cities.
And we had some of that in the 80s too. We didn't go down as much here probably as I did in southern Minnesota, because that's what it was. It was farmland and that was it. There was no other opportunities. Today, western Wisconsin is so much. It's easy for people to get into the cities, and they don't have to go to work in the cities every day. They can do it online.
Yeah.
So they, it makes western Wisconsin more favorable outlook
Yep.
to live here compared, and if you go into the cities and ask people where you live, and they go, it's all they can think of is Wisconsin is like 2-3 hours away. They don't realize how close it is, because
Yeah.
most of western Wisconsin's closer to the cities than most of Minnesota. So
Right. That's I try and explain that to people, and they'll say, "Where are you close to Madison, or are you close to?" And I go, "We're further west than half of Minnesota."
yeah,
You know,
yeah,
it's but and that's been good and bad.
yeah,
But yeah, the cities have really affected that. And what chews up, like when people talk about housing developments and stuff, and they hate housing developments, I think housing developments are a wonderful thing because you concentrate these houses to a certain extent, because farms get chewed up from, somebody buys 40 acres and puts a house in the middle of it.
yeah, yeah. That can happen. That's prevalent in some townships or counties. You see that in some of the towns, the local. It depends on what the mood of the local town boards are. So
Yeah. So that kind of stuff is kind of interesting, but there's no doubt that our area is probably going to continue to grow. I don't,
yeah, yeah,
you know, um, and agriculture is going to change with it. But like, the opportunity there, like I said, when my daughter talks about, and she said to me, she she's helping a neighbor milk a few cows, and she really likes it.
yeah.
She goes, well, maybe we'll fill up our barn again. I go, no. I go, but if you learn cheese making and that kind of stuff, I go, well, you could never sell fluid milk. Don't ever try and do that, or yogurt or anything super perishable. You can store cheese.
Right,
That's the beauty of grain farming, is you can store grain.
right, right.
Steers, when steers are ready, they got to go. Otherwise, they continue to cost you money while they
Right.
sit there. And
Right.
same with pigs, and same with milk.
Right.
You sold milk, whether there was never once where I just told the milk hauler and he backed up and said, "Nope, you guys aren't paying enough today. I'm going to wait."
Yeah,
It
it
just
doesn't work that way.
nope.
Yeah,
Where something like a cheese, I think there's some opportunity there, and so that part of the cities is good. And like I said, you look at farm size here, I say, and part of it's field size and part of it's our land,
Yeah.
but farm size around here is probably a third to half of a more typical grain farming area,
yeah,
very easily.
yeah. Yep.
The biggest farmers in our immediate area are 3,000 to 4,000 acres.
Right, and that's relatively small compared to southern Minnesota and some
Right.
other areas. But you're dealing with smaller fields and everything, and
Yeah,
so
but
we have non-farm income opportunities that are really good here. So being close to the cities,
yeah,
and so I don't think they need to be as big normally. I don't know, but they're all growing too,
yeah.
because their
Oh,
costs keep going up, and then technology keeps changing, and I don't know what we'll do down the road here. Or do maybe a little bit less hay, or maybe more round bales. I don't know. I don't know, because I don't. The only time I don't like small squares is when I have to unload the loads myself.
yeah, yeah.
Then it's not any fun. But because then it's about 3 or 4 times you have to touch it to get it into the barn.
Well, and that's why everybody wants to. I always say that about land rents, where actually it was kind of funny. So there were some local guys that had money that invested in farmland in southern Minnesota, because they were able to go buy farmland down there, sometimes cheaper than it was around here. When it bottomed out,
Right,
and even
right.
into the 90s, it was cheaper down there, and then
Right.
it took off, and then
Yeah.
but the land rent down there, when you look at the value per farmland acre down there versus say here, the land rent is not in the same ratio. For what an acre is worth up here versus its land rent value is significantly different than it is.
Yeah, one thing that Wisconsin does, and I know they pay a lot more real estate taxes over in Minnesota
Yeah.
than we do here.
use value.
Yeah, so we've been very blessed with that. That's really helped agriculture over here. So
And but I think the other thing, a lot of the land rents were reflected on when we had livestock and dairy around here. Because for years, it probably wasn't until, the RFS and in the 2000s when if you wanted to rent land in the early 2000s or the late 90s, there was land out there you could rent. Today, you can't just say I'd like to run more acres like that.
it's harder.
Right.
It's a relationship type thing in certain areas. Some areas just by value.
Yeah.
So it just depends on the areas.
But I think around here, it was when everybody had livestock and was milking cows, as long as you could feed your cows, that's really all you were concerned about. Then when everybody started crop farming, you're like, well, I can get a bigger planter, bigger tractors, bigger dryer, bigger combine, and I could just farm more.
Right. Right.
Where before it was kind of like, well, hey, we've got enough to feed the cows. We're good.
Right. Right.
So I think that probably was reflected. So I think that's going to go away as time goes on. I think land rents will keep creeping up just because some of that's forgotten,
Well, as yields keep going up, the costs keep going up, so I don't know. It's, you look at the trend, it just, you don't want deflation.
No.
You want a little bit of inflation, but, it still really comes down to, the marketing and, having, growing a good crop, but, we're not always in control of the crop, production because there's other variable factors that can the production. So, that's where crop insurance does help. I mean, obviously I sold crop insurance for many years myself. So and we carry it too. Where I'm a firm believer in it. It takes the edges off.
All right. So I should tell you my story though, that, so you helped me when I bought my first piece of land. Okay. That was, but the biggest favor you ever did to me, and it was at the time I didn't think you were doing me a favor. I was pissed for a long time. But you remember I was gonna expand my dairy, and it was probably 06, 07, somewhere in there. So I was milking, about 50 cows. And we had stray voltage, and I had recovered. I won most improved herd, but I took on extra debt. Well, and I bought that farm, my farm where I'm at today. That was almost unheard of somebody my age having a farm like that.
Right.
I stuck my neck out, and after the stray voltage and rewiring, and then having to buy more cows. Then we lost some cows. We had a disease issue for a little bit. We lost another dozen cows, and I'm getting by, but I mean, I am cash poor. I'm like, I need more cattle. That's the only way this is going to work. And at the time, my bank was being sold. They were for sale.
Right.
And farm loans were not desirable on the books. So they did not want me to expand. They're like, no, absolutely not.
Right.
And my loan officer and I always got along really good.
Yep.
But he's like, yeah, they will not do an expansion. So this is 07. This was 07 into 08, as a matter of fact. It was like late 07 into like January, February timeframe 08. And I'm trying to expand, so I'm like, I'm going to have to find a different lender. Now, I had FSA guarantees on my loan, so FSA was always an option.
Right.
But I was like, well, I'm going to start checking around. And I checked with a bank that a friend of mine banked with, and they said no, and I had really good production. I had good equity for my age, but they just right away no. And as it turns out later, I come to find out, I think they had invested big in the housing development stuff.
Okay.
This was into 08, early 08. So
right.
they're in pretty deep,
Yep.
in housing stuff.
Yep.
So then I talked to you,
Yep.
and you said, I'll come out.
Yep.
And you looked at it and you said, yeah, you're getting good milk. And I was a one-man show,
Right.
and I did everything myself. You got good equity. You had the young farmer specialist come out, and she
Yeah.
goes, yeah, this looks good. And my bank had an interim, they had hired a vice president or an interim president to run the bank while it was for sale. So they had hired this guy. He hated agriculture. He did not like my loan because I'm,
Yep.
a young dairy farmer. He wanted me gone to begin with. So there was no discussion on this expansion. There was no nothing. And you came out. We did some numbers and everything. You called me on I forget what day it was, and you said, "Yeah, I think we can do it." We were going to go to I think 80 cows, and I was just excited. And I called my banker, and like I said, him and I always got along. And I said, "Roger," I said, "I'm going to go with AgStar at the time it was." And, I always enjoyed working with you, Roger. I go, but do me a favor and tell that interim president he can kiss my ass. And I'm like, all right. A day later, you called me and said the underwriters don't like your taxes. And what you told me was that my production was too high for what my expenses showed. And the reason for that was because I did all my own work. All my own repairs, you name it. Heck,
Right.
I even overhauled Carl Hendrickson's tractor that previous winter in my shop to try and, when I wasn't milking
To
3
generate
times.
income. Yeah.
And you're like, we need to do your taxes for the next couple of years just so we know that this is legit. And I go, well, I have no bank currently. So, and I said, can you at least just take over my loans without the expansion? And you said, no, the underwriters won't let us. And I had to call my banker back, and he's like, all right. And I go, well, obviously he doesn't want to do the expansion. I go, but my operating note's coming due. It was getting to be springtime. And he goes, yeah, they're not going to renew it. And I'm like, oh. So I had a 4455 that was just a peach. It was my baby. And I sold it.
Yep.
I got the cash out of it. I owed a little bit to Deere, paid Deere off, and then I paid off my operating note. I don't know if I had $1,000 or $2,000 left over, something like that. And it was enough that I went to Ellsworth Equipment. They had a 4320 sitting on the lot. It was a down payment to New Holland Credit to get that tractor so that I had a tractor to run.
Right.
But, and then I said and my banker, and he was on my side the whole time.
Right,
He's
right.
like, we can pay off the operating note. And I go, so now they got to play ball because, I don't need them. I mean, I'm making my payments.
Right.
And I go, hey, I said, I can be the biggest pain in your ass you've ever dealt with, or we can sit down and figure something out. And that's what we did. And then they said, yes, you can expand. And then I decided to back out of the expansion and to just get rid of the cows. But when that happened, I mean, it left me in a bad spot, but that was one of the biggest blessings ever.
Because you didn't expand.
I didn't expand.
Yeah. And then you went and got non-farm income.
Yep.
And then, yep.
So I grew my land base. So the next 2009, so what happened, that was 2008. By early winter, January, February of 2009, milk prices crashed.
Oh yeah, they did.
And
Right.
and that next spring, I had to buy the lower 30 acres of my farm. There was like 31 or 32
Right,
acres. It was an 80 minus
Mm-hmm.
that lot that Tingelhoff sold out of there. I had to buy that next spring. If I would have survived, I not only would have not been able to buy that land, but I mean, I would have been barely,
Floating yourself.
period.
Right.
So the best thing that ever happened to me was to not expand.
So it was good. I said no.
It was great. At the time, I was like, because it was terrible timing, but it worked out perfect. And that's where God does that sometimes.
Well, he's in control. You don't know. Sometimes no doesn't sound so good at the time. But
Right. But that was one of the, I was like, yeah, that worked out perfect, you know?
well, it jettisoned you onto what you got now. So you made it through that non-farm income, all the other things you got going on. So
Yeah. Yeah. We ended up, like I said, I ended up buying way more land than, you know, that, that next spring when it was time to buy that other 30 acres, it was no big deal.
yeah.
And then, had started my other business. And,
Yep.
and a couple years later, we were able to buy a little more land and then a little bit more and then a little bit more. And it all worked out that if I'd have been milking cows, that never would have happened.
Yeah. Yeah, you just don't know. You don't know, Like I said, I told you, that's what my friends and I, we were going to milk cows, but it didn't turn out that way. So
No, and
sometimes we had to get smaller to get better. What happened? Some of it in the 80s. So,
yeah,
or change what you were doing and people telling you things. And you don't realize it when you're in the mix of it sometimes. You just don't realize it.
the lesson that I've taken away from most of this, and even looking at my parents' farm, because before my parents bought their farm, there was a lot of money spent on the livestock industry, livestock facilities. There were, I saw the number at one point, what was owed against that farm. It was all due to a big expansion.
Yeah.
And then my parents remodeled that setup and everything. And I look at that and I look at the money that was spent on that farm in the last 50 years, right? The value of that farm today is not higher one bit due to any of that money spent.
Yeah.
If none of that ever would have been improved on that farm is still worth the same today.
See, it's like land and gold. They're kind of the same. See?
Well, but it's the lesson is be careful with facilities, and
Oh yeah.
because I was going to take all the equity I had to leverage it to expand as far as facilities and more cows, and that cattle prices tanked. Facilities, once they're built, are worth pennies on the dollar.
Well, years ago they built the standard dairy barn, and that probably lasted, in Wisconsin, probably 60 to 80 to almost 100 years. It would still have had value. But then all of a sudden, it's kind of like the John Deere 7000 four-row corn planter. All of a sudden, everybody had them, and then everyone went to 6 or 8 or 12 or whatever, and they weren't worth anything. It just all of a sudden happened. The same thing happened to small dairy barns. All of a sudden, they just they weren't worth anything, no matter what. And it just, you're right. Facilities.
Silos. I mean, there was, if you had a corn unit on that farm, boy, it was worth more money because of that corn unit. And today it'd be worth more money, if they could, at one point, now that kind of turned the other way, but at one point it was like, I remember them appraising the farm saying it'd be worth more if you got rid of all these silos, and stuff. And that was the hard thing for me was when I bought that farm, it was a lot of money at the time. I placed the biggest value on the livestock facility there.
Yeah.
And at one point so I bought it in 2004. It took until probably 2012 really to catch back up to that value because facilities tanked, but then the house went up in value, the land went up in value, and and then now today obviously then it's astronomically increased. But at the time there was a drop. From 2004, that was about the end of when these smaller dairies were worth something. And then the silos. But now today, if you have a nice dairy barn, nice 2-story dairy barn somewhere with even a silo with it that looks good, if it's structurally good, there's value in that again.
Yeah. Some hobbyists still like them.
Yeah, people want to have that in the background, and So it kind of goes full circle. And 7,000 corn planters in, '04, 2002, they weren't worth anything.
Right.
Nobody wanted them. And now they're worth money again because everybody wants a food plot. So it's funny if you
Yeah.
hold on,
Yep.
that stuff will
Yep.
hang in there. But yeah, agriculture is a unique, you can call it a business, but it's more of a life, I think.
Well, it's on the smaller scale side. On the bigger ones, I mean, you got so many employees or so much at risk. It's there's lots of opportunities for everybody, and still in agriculture, there's probably a lot of industries that's not like that.
Yeah.
Is it consolidated some? Yeah, but you can still be a small person and you can still make it. You might have non-farm income, but you can still have the lifestyle. So
Yeah. Well, and even I've given that advice to some young people, and they don't want to hear it. I've heard them say, "Well, I want to expand, I want to grow," and I've said, "Well, yeah, I don't know that that's the best idea. I think I look at it like this: if you really want to farm, go be an electrician, because it's easy to be a self-employed electrician, and your overhead being an electrician, like with tile work. Look at my overhead that I have and the effort it takes. You can be a self-employed electrician and put in 4 hours one day, make pretty good money, and then get back to your farming, whatever you got to do. You can be self-employed, set your own schedule, etc. And billable time being an electrician is massive, right? So do that, and then take all that. And without that overhead, you're going to get nailed on taxes really bad because you don't have a ton of equipment to depreciate, et cetera, being an electrician. That's where your farm comes in.
right.
And you start building your farm and, go be that electrician for X number of years. And then when that lands $10,000, $12,000 an acre and people are like, how can you ever pay for that? Well, if you're a successful electrician, it's probably pretty easy to pay for that land. And even if you're paying pretty good interest, you're writing the interest off. You need the deductions on the business. And then if you've got a couple hundred acres of paid for land, you get to a certain age and you can just farm your couple hundred acres and you'll be just fine.
Yeah. No, there's opportunities for everybody. So
I mean,
no farming, been involved in it pretty much for, grew up on a small farm and stayed involved, went to school for it,
yeah.
worked in the different Pearson, St. Croix, and Eau Claire and Chippewa counties, and it's always been good to me. I mean, the 80s were a little tough, but things do get better after they've been tough for a while. Well, even actually the 2014, 13 to 2020 weren't that nice.
Yeah.
They were a little tough then too. Boy, she was tight, really tight. I mean, there's been different times over the years it's been tight, but
13 and 14 were especially tough because we had such a correction as far as price, but then our yields here, 13 and 14 were tough around here, yield wise.
Yeah, I like I said, it's been good. And there's still a lot of opportunities, and I mean, I look at all the guys I went to school with, and what they did in agriculture, and a lot of them are still farming, and it's been a good thing for their families, and it's been a good thing for ours, and I know, the nice thing I always liked about Pierce and St. Croix County is that a lot of family farm, down to earth, willing to help people, that's what I always enjoyed. It was always fun to go to work,
Yeah.
and not except for the 80s were a little tough, but otherwise most of the time, it was always fun because you were dealing down to earth people, and they just everybody was just trying to do a better job and get better at what they were doing. Sometimes did I have to say no? Yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't the most favorite part of the job that I liked, but anyways, it worked out for most. I know there's a few that didn't like to hear no a few times. That didn't work out, but when I was originally started out, I was like the underwriter myself and everything. But then when we merged with AgStar in the early 2000s, they split that apart.
Yep.
So which didn't have as much flexibility as I probably did, but sometimes that kept me out of trouble too. So I don't know. It seems that's how they. I don't know. I don't know, because sometimes you can get more. Having another pair of eyes look at stuff sometimes gives you a different perspective. But I'm glad it worked out for you, Ryan.
Well, yeah, and like I said, the model that I had didn't fit, a mold.
Right.
Like that just was unheard of.
Right.
And to an underwriter, they're looking typically somebody farming like I did that owned a farm that was a family farm. That was, or there'd probably be another family member involved. There would be,
Yeah.
or a spouse or something, but
Right.
there wasn't. I was a single guy that owned his own farm
Yeah.
and they're like, well, these numbers, and I think that's what you said, is that they just don't believe that your numbers are what they are because, nobody does. I didn't hire any custom work done. I wasn't, except I was having somebody plant my corn.
Yeah.
But other than that, all my own chopping, all my own repairs, et cetera. And it just didn't. They're like, well, because you said your expenses are too low, and I'm like, I thought that was a good thing. It just doesn't. But they don't understand why that was.
Right.
And a lot of times, as a, and like with being with a smaller bank, my loan officer knew me.
Right.
Because even he said, you're one of the only people, he goes, that I will consider a tractor anything less than an intermediate asset. Because, I would buy a tractor, then I'd sell a tractor or
Right.
whatever. It was somewhat liquid.
Yep.
Anywhere else, that had to be put as an intermediate
Right.
asset.
Right.
He's like, no, you buy a tractor, and then a week later, you might just have it sold.
Right. Yeah. Do some work on it and sell it. Yep.
Yeah, and he goes, so as a small bank, he could do that sort of
Yeah.
stuff. He had a little bit more freedom. And he goes, no, I know this guy can do this. Now, if this other farmer said, this is, I can do this, I might be, But, when you guys became AgStar, it was a pretty large geographical area
Right.
you were covering. So, yeah, it was a whole different thing.
Yeah.
But no, it worked out perfect as it turns out. But
Oh, that's good.
yeah, so well, I suppose before the weather gets bad here again, so
Yeah.
all right. Well, thanks, Pete.
Yeah. No, it's been good talking with you, Ryan.
Yeah.